Hi everyone and welcome. Today I decided to do a special recording where I intend to talk about new planetary archetypes which are already included in modern astrology, but they aren't really mentioned or taken very seriously in consideration by modern day astrologers. But of course, this is no surprise, because most of these objects were just recently discovered, so even astrologers, have to observe and see how these energies and these planetary influences play out in a very practical manner. The philosophy of it, the theory of it, the spiritual connotation, let's say, that is, susceptible to interpretation, but the physical effects, or what the conversation of these objects actually produce in physical reality, how they influence our moods, our psyches, our decision-making process, the role of any astrological object, may it be like a physical object or just fictive objects like the nodes of the moon, dark moon, Lilith, etc. So the only way we can tell for certain what these new planetary archetypes do and how they influence our lives more collectively than individually is living it and observing, witnessing, and documenting, of course. So this is the reason astrologers don't take them too seriously into consideration. Because, even though we know the theory, even though we understand the symbolism and the likelihood, we don't have a great deal of certainty of how the energy of those objects plays out. A symbolism can play out in so very many different ways, in so many different nuances that we need to live it, experience it, and document it in order to actually assume what we are saying, what we are forecasting, predicting with the help of these new planetary archetypes. Now, before I begin, I would just like to mention that these are not asteroids. Asteroids are actually part of modern astrology, and they are regarded as minor astrological influences. Of course, it really depends in which sign, which asteroid is in, what kind of aspect it holds. And even though these are very minor power players, sometimes their symbolism is really, really intense, especially as they influence us collectively. Like, let me just give you examples. One of the biggest and most influential asteroids out there is Ceres. Ceres is the Roman goddess of the grain, of agriculture, of nurture and harvest. The Greek correspondent is Demetra. And Ceres was an active part of January 2019's Saturn and Pluto conjunction, a very, very important and rare astrological event, which on the world stage played out as the COVID situation, which started to profoundly transform centralized power and our social structures, etc. But Ceres was part of this conjunction as well, and the way her symbolism played out in very many countries and cultures all around the world. This also included a kind of agricultural crisis, agricultural transformation, in the sense that, everyone kind of understood more profoundly that the local agriculture, local produce of farmers, etc., is very, very important and is a core element to the well-functioning of society. So this is where it played out in the sense that many countries try to encourage local growth rather than import. Another asteroid of whom symbolism played out in a very, very striking manner was the asteroid Hygeia, goddess of health, basically. And even though I really sorry, but I don't remember with great precision the aspects that she held exactly when the COVID situation started globally. She was part of a square, and washing hands, personal hygiene, the wearing of the mask, and us being way more conscious about how viruses and pathogens are transmitted. That is how her symbolism instantly played out at that time. So even though asteroids are minor astrological influences, very many times their symbolism is very, very straightforward and almost instant. Before I move on to the main subject, I would just like to mention a few other very symbolic asteroids which always hold certain kind of celestial conversations. So besides Ceres, there is Pallas Athena, goddess of wisdom but also tactics. And even though her symbolism is that of a female, her energy can be quite masculine at times, because Pallas Athena is almost like a combination of Mercury and Mars. She chooses wisdom, tactics, rationality, foresight as her main tool. But when wisdom fails or when tactics fail, there is always brute force. Another very important asteroid is Juno, wife of Jupiter, of course. She is all about decisions and justice, what is fair and what is not fair, but from a very, let's say, female perspective. So she stirs up emotions when her influence invites us to make a judgment, a decision, a choice, or take certain things into consideration. Chiron is another very important asteroid. And even though Chiron physically is not very big, perhaps it is his symbolism which is the most influential out of all the asteroids, because it is the wounded healer. Wherever he is, well, it represents our woundings, and at the same time what we do with our wounds. So this is an asteroid which a lot of astrologers always take into consideration, especially when it holds important aspects. Of course, this is somewhat self-explanatory and almost natural, because we're living, breathing human beings, so our wounds matter more than we could possibly imagine. There is another asteroid which falls into the centaur category. Chiron is one of the most symbolic centaurs. It is his wife in mythology, the asteroid Chariklo, and she has a lot to do with spiritual healing. Her symbolism is very, very rarely used. Another very commonly looked at asteroid is Vesta, keeper of the sacred flame. She has a lot to do with our inner fire, especially the solar plexus chakra. But she is a very spiritual energy, so her influence is extremely subtle, and of course there are some people who might not feel it whatsoever, or whose lives won't be affected by it whatsoever, because in the day and age that we are living in, not a lot of things are sacred. And of course, besides these asteroids, there are many others out there. But, as I said, most of them are minor astrological influences, and they don't really affect us that much. So that's why astrologers don't talk about them a great deal. Now, going back to our subject, let's take a look at these new planetary archetypes and what their possible influence might be. And as I said earlier, even though their influence is quite subtle, quite karmic, but all of this in the big picture, most of them don't influence us that very much personally, individually, but rather collectively, because some of these objects move extraordinarily slowly. So of course, they influence our collective evolution much more than individually. Especially that, some of these objects, all of us alive here today will have them in the same sign because they move so very, very slowly. For example, one of these objects is Sedna, a dwarf planet, and it takes her about 10,000 years to revolve around the zodiac, so you can imagine that she will be an active, almost integral part of the sign where she resides in for a lot of years. Most of these objects are called trans-Neptunian objects because they are beyond the orbit of Neptune, and of course Pluto is one of the most iconic of these, but Pluto is a little bit controversial because it was a planet not so long ago, so even astrologers considered it as a planet, and it gained a lot of influence in astrology, and rightfully so, because Pluto was discovered in the 1930s, and its symbolism became extremely obvious to astrologers in a rather shocking way. Because, in the Second World War, there was the Hiroshima bombing, and that event was, something that humanity never experienced before, in the bad sense, unimaginable cruelty. And usually war is started from an astrological perspective by Mars, and astrologers, of course, took a look at Mars, what aspects it is holding, what is it doing, but it just couldn't explain the unimaginable cruelty that played out in the world. So they took a look at what else could be so very influential, and there was Pluto. And that's how it was considered the higher octave of Mars, an extremely profound transformative energy. And of course Pluto is one of the slowest major astrological power players, and in astrology, the slower a planet moves and the further away it is from the sun, its power is that much greater and that much more collectively influential. And of course, needless to say that out of all the trans-Neptunian objects, Pluto is the biggest and the most dense, scientifically speaking. And of course, Pluto is not just a planet or a planetoid, a dwarf planet, but it is a system. It is formed out of Pluto and Charon, and in mythology, Charon was who guided the souls of the dead into the underworld. So we can already see how Pluto is so very linked to death and how it became the ruling planet of Scorpio. So basically, if Pluto is so very strong and influential, the other trans-Neptunian objects, even though they are a little bit, but just a little bit, smaller than Pluto, some of them are even further away from the sun, and some of them move much slower than Pluto. So you can imagine the karmic influences that these objects might have. Let's start with a planetoid that I mentioned earlier, Sedna. Sedna is a female energy, a female deity linked to water and oceans, and she has a deeply, deeply spiritual expression. Basically, she holds a spiritual frequency. Spiritually speaking, all of us have Sedna in the sign of Taurus, regardless of where that falls in our personal chart. And because she moves so slowly, even past generations, our grandparents would have had Sedna in the same part of the sky. And what this tells us is Sedna's deep connection with the sign of Taurus. Well, Taurus is nature, Taurus is Mother Earth. So basically, it is the spiritual frequency that is permanent within nature. Taurus is a very conservative sign, a very conservative energy. Nature has her own set of rules. Nature is her own ruler, so to speak. And very many times, the ways of Mother Nature don't really agree with our highest spiritual philosophies. there isn't much human morality within nature. Predator and the prey, death is a natural part of the cycle, all of which might seem kind of sad and, depressing to us. Yet there is a lot of magic, mystery, and divine within nature, regardless of what her rules are, regardless of how her balance is constructed, and basically that is Sedna. Just as Mother Nature evolves physically, she also evolves spiritually as well. So in astrology, Sedna is kind of responsible for the evolution of planet Earth, even from a metaphysical perspective. So she has to basically hold her ground, because evolution takes like a lot of years, even million years. Another very important trans-Neptunian object, another dwarf planet, is none other than Eris, and I mentioned her quite a lot of times in my horoscopes. Eris is also extremely slow moving. I do believe that it takes her about 500 years to make a rotation. And Eris is a female energy of the warrior archetype. In mythology, she is the sister of Mars. She is also known as Discordia, Discord, the legend of the apple of discord. And that is basically what she does. She throws discord, chaos, rebellion, revolution, sometimes even violence, extremely assertive actions, in order to stir things up. And even though she is chaotic and she can be perceived as rather fearful and frightening, her main goal is to reveal the truth, because, when chaos strikes, it actually works with the truth. When something goes bad, it doesn't really go bad because it has to go bad. It goes bad because there is something hidden within. And that is revealed by, let's say, the unfortunate event. And Eris also resides in the warrior sign of Aries, the initiator, the courage, bravery, and of course the first breath. So basically she is our survival instincts, and she is a power player which became extremely active in the last couple of years, because she holds a tensionate aspect, a square with Pluto, and this square is ongoing in the present moment as well. And the symbolism was so, and is still so very obvious. People taking to the streets, demanding their rights, fighting for equality, for justice, whatever it takes for their voices to be heard, for their rights and liberties to be respected. And this energy is going to be very active all throughout 2021, even 2022. And even though Pluto is extremely influential in the sign of Capricorn, it is power, and the power which, governments, leaders, structures hold over all of us. If there is a power player in the sky who can actually challenge Pluto in all of his majesty and infinite strength, well, that is Eris, because Eris actually loves situations where she is outnumbered, when the odds are actually against her. She takes pride in triumph when she has absolutely no chance to win. She has to basically find a way through chaos, the apple of discord, to turn the situation in her favor, or at least bring out the truth. And when the truth is out, it will just do the work for her. Now moving on, we also have two very positive planetary archetypes. One is Makemake. It is an ancient god of creation and fertility, a representation of the creative aspect of the divine masculine, native to the Easter Islands, and his, let's say, female counterpart, which is the representative of the creative aspect and restorative, nourishing aspect of the divine feminine. It is the planetoid Haumea. I'm not really sure if I'm pronouncing this correctly. and she is the Hawaiian goddess of fertility, childbirth, and of course magic and mysteries. Both of these dwarf planets are in the sign of Libra, and this is so very symbolic and quite deep because, especially right now, the world is going through a massive chaos. So there is a lot of fear, depression, heartache. Some people lost absolutely everything, and I'm not just talking about earthly possessions, but their faith, their individuality, everything that they thought to be true about themselves. But even in the darkest moments, maybe we can find salvation in our relationships, the sign of Libra. And of course, this can also represent divine justice, where earthly justice fails us. Perhaps there is divine justice, or at least some kind of magic or creational energy out there which can turn things around for us, as long as, Libra is ruled by the planet Venus, goddess of love and beauty, as long as there is genuine love in our hearts. And there is a very specific reason why I put a lot of emphasis on this. That is because very soon we are going to have a cardinal grand cross. Now, in astrology, a cardinal grand cross is quite a challenging, heavy, and transformative energy. People who have a cardinal grand cross in their personal charts, for example, they might go through a very difficult moment, or they might have almost impossible to overcome challenges at one point in their lives, but that deeply transforms them, and that turns into pure power and blessing, but not a blessing which is just bestowed upon them. It is something that they create themselves. And this cardinal grand cross is not held by the big power players. It is held by Eris in the sign of Aries, Pluto in the sign of Capricorn. Then we have Venus in the sign of Cancer, and Haumea, I'm not sure how to pronounce this, in the sign of Libra. Needless to say that this might be an extremely chaotic and emotionally very, very hard moment for us, especially. This is where it's also individual, because Venus is a personal planet, goddess of love and beauty, everything that we love, our magnetism, everything that we would like to attract in our lives. So this Venus's presence makes this energy quite personal. And regardless of how this may play out in love, in romance, in self-esteem, everything that we think we deserve and need to have in our lives, it can be also material, because Venus rules currency, and the sign of Cancer can represent our past as well. So who knows how this may play out, but I do believe that this is where Haumea in the sign of Libra can be a saving grace. Another person, Libra, partnership. Someone out there is sure to hear our cries, is sure to maybe feel our sadness empathically. So who knows how salvation, how this alchemical expression of this Grand Cross can actually transform our lives, our psyche, our emotional worlds in the most amazing way possible. But before it gets better, it has to get worse. So regardless of how this may play out in our lives personally, don't abandon hope, because there has to be someone out there, even if it's not a person, Haumea, goddess of creation, fertility, and magic. Maybe it's a spirit, maybe it's an ancestor, maybe it is just the divine, but someone or something can hear us, can understand us, can feel for us, and it can truly help us alchemize regardless of how this Grand Cross plays out, so that it truly serves our future and it can actually be the key to a kind of balance which we might never have obtained all throughout our lives, regardless of how smart, intelligent, emotionally intelligent, spiritual, wise, or insert any virtue or good quality here. Because, Eris in the sign of Aries is about the self, what we truly deserve, for the very simple fact that we were born, that we are living, breathing beings here on earth. For the simple fact that we were born and embraced life, we deserve everything that is decent, we deserve to have rights, and we deserve ultimately to find happiness, whatever that means to us in this life. But there is Pluto in the sign of Capricorn. We also have duties, responsibilities, karmic issues to deal with, let's say. So we have to find our happiness in lives and our own personal destinies and karma's terms, even if that is difficult and deeply transformative in maybe not the most comfortable ways. Because Pluto in Capricorn can also represent that we have to burn our ancestral karma and everything that basically takes our power away. And then there is Venus in the sign of Cancer. We are not alone in this life. We have families, we have loved ones, we have our local community, let's say, or wherever we belong in our world, in this world. And even if, let's say, we are hermit, still we are in this world, so we resonate with the collective, like it or not. And naturally, we have emotional needs. Venus in the sign of Cancer, we all need love in our lives one way or another. And Venus in Cancer is also pleasure. So pleasure has to be part of our lives, because otherwise we are not really human beings. And finally, there is Haumea in the sign of Libra. Even when we feel lost, there can still be some kind of magic within our relationships, even if it's just karmic relationship, or even if it's just us and the divine, there is still magic there. And let's not forget, they have a very wise saying that the divine God, call it whatever you want, usually works through people. So, this might be one of the biggest lessons and wisdom in this Grand Cross. And finally, the last trans-Neptunian object that I would like to mention, even though there are others, but the others are even more controversial and subjective and mysterious than the ones I mentioned here. So the last one is Celestia. She is the wife of Neptune, so her symbolism is very, very similar to that of Neptune, but Neptune in itself it is extremely ethereal. It is not real, it is not palpable, we cannot touch it, we cannot basically sense it directly. Like Neptune can be seen as the illusion. Everything that an artist creates, words, speech, painting, whatever, it is just an illusion made real. But at the same time, Neptune is also the higher octave of Venus, so it is unconditional love, the divine source, spirituality, a transcendence, altered state of consciousness. And none of these is actually something palpable, something real in a material sense. But if Neptune is so very ethereal, then imagine something which is even more subjective than Neptune, and that is exactly his wife, Celestia. She is basically the expression of divine beauty, which is deeply, deeply, deeply buried inside of us. And regardless of how, let's say, spiritual, intuitive, empathic, call it whatever you want we are, sometimes it takes certain alignments and moments in life when that beauty just comes out but it lasts for a very short time. Let me just give you an example. A sunset, or let's say maybe sunrise at sea, when the rays of the sun hit the water, the ocean, and it creates an indescribable feeling, and even the image that we see with our physical eyes, it is something extremely outer worldly, or it is extremely magical, and no matter what we do, we cannot recreate these moments. It has to be that special alignment when we are at, let's say, the sea and it is sunrise or sunset, and that magical moment just grabs our attention and it brings forth the divine beauty from within, because we resonate with it, because we are also it. And basically that is Celestia. And even though one might say that it is basically maybe just a fantasy, maybe just a random moment, yet the power of that single moment can be profoundly healing. Let me just give you an example. Imagine when someone, and I'm really sorry to use such a dark example, wants to end their lives because they're ill, because they're depressed, it doesn't matter. And before they just walk on the beach, and one of these moments just hits them and it changes everything, because they taste that very special magic which is within them, and it heals them. Maybe a psychologist, astrologer, their friends, their family couldn't heal them. No matter what they did, it just didn't work. And a moment like this just strikes like a lightning bolt and it heals everything. It just conjures up a totally different meaning of life which was invisible until that moment. And Celestia is in the sign of Aries, again, the self, the first breath, the meaning of earthly existence. So basically this concludes today's recording. I really hope that you enjoyed it. And it is such a really good example of how spirituality and even spiritual science, astrology, evolves together with perhaps its empirical expression, astronomy. So new astronomical discoveries maybe don't just revolutionize the scientific community, but also the spirit and our perception and understanding of the spirit. And implicitly, this also means that even as a species, as human beings, we are in the process of discovering more and more and more of ourselves, perhaps our divine origins, and most importantly, that we are much, much more than meets the eye, if this makes sense. So thank you again for listening. Until next time, bye for now.